Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we're currently looking at is The Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake. And this is a stimulating, thought-provoking, unorthodox and very illuminating book, an appraisal of science by a scientist, part critique, part heresy, part guide for renewal, whose ideas I'm going to set out here in 4 sections, which I've called, firstly, positioning Sheldrake, secondly, his sociological critique, thirdly, his scientific critique, and lastly, Sheldrake's alternatives. So, kicking off then with part 1, positioning Sheldrake. And I think that Sheldrake is a really distinctive thinker, and it's useful to get a sense of where he's coming from. And where he's coming from, I think, first and foremost, is that he is a scientist, telling us that I've spent all my adult life as a scientist, and I strongly believe in the scientific approach. He studied and taught at Cambridge, where he was intimate with some of its leading and Nobel Prize-winning luminaries, including Francis Crick and Sidney Brenner, and he's been published in numerous peer-reviewed scientific journals and is a visiting professor at several universities. But if he's a scientist, he's not a conventional or a singular one, and in some ways he might be seen to embody 3 different scientific types all rolled into one: a scientist of open-minded inquiry, a critical scientist, and a heretical scientist. And as a scientist of open-minded inquiry, he makes it clear that innovation, asking new questions, building new theories, and rigorously testing them are not only at the creative heart of science, but are its very definition: science as process rather than a set of beliefs. And his own open-minded inquiry, and much of the argument in this book, I think can be seen as his particular intellectual and creative response to the radical implications of quantum mechanics and Big Bang theory, which he argues have not only transformed physics, but have drawn a coach and horses through the old laws and the old certainties of orthodox science, undermining the foundations of what he calls mechanistic science and scientific materialism. And what this means for Sheldrake's science of open-minded inquiry is that the dominant theoretical understanding of our natural world not only renders what Sheldrake calls the dogmas of scientific materialism as invalid, but also opens up a range of theoretical possibilities which seem to violate common sense and which are mostly not embraced by contemporary science, but which Sheldrake wants science and us to take seriously and make open to further investigation, including such things as causation from the future and panpsychism, which holds, in the words of Schopenhauer, that things, potentially even atoms and molecules, possess a will that may be expressed as desire, feelings, or emotions. And if quantum theory provides the foundation for Sheldrake as a scientist of open-minded inquiry, I think it's also the start point of both his critical and heretical forms of science. And speaking to the first of these, clearly the book's title, The Delusion, makes his position clear. And one of the ways he seeks to demonstrate what he considers to be the fallacies of established science is to interrogate what might be called the Ricky Gervais thesis of science, that is to say that science seeks the truth, does not discriminate, is humble and knows what it knows and what it doesn't, bases its conclusions on hard evidence, is constantly updated, doesn't get offended by new facts, and doesn't hold on to medieval practices because they are tradition. And Sheldrake makes it very clear that these are ideas that he takes very seriously, telling us that they were and still are wonderful ideals, and they have inspired scientists for generations. They inspire me. I'm all in favour of science and reason if they are scientific and reasonable, but I am against granting scientists and the materialist worldview an exemption from critical thinking and sceptical investigation. And he goes on to assert that this book is an experiment in which I apply these ideals to science itself, which, although at the peak of its power, is, according to Sheldrake, in trouble and facing unexpected problems. Problems which Sheldrake argues are symptoms of a deeper malaise that science now finds itself in, a condition which he frames as a mixture of the baggage inherited from its European past, centuries of old assumptions now hardened into dogmas, and the belief that it already knows the answers and the fundamental questions have been settled. And taken together, Sheldrake argues these amount to a belief system which, although contrary to the spirit of true science, now governs scientific thinking, absorbed, taken for granted, but never discussed by the scientists themselves, and which has over time crystallized to become a scientific creed, which he formulates into a list of 10 dogmas, each of which he devotes a chapter in the book to in his role as a critical scientist, so that of the book's 12 chapters, 10 are positions of critique, part sociological and part scientific. And in this critique, I think we can glimpse Sheldrake as the final type of scientist, that is to say, a heretical scientist, a rebel from within the scientific creed, whose rebellion is made worse because it's from one of their own. And his heresy is not confined to attacking what he sees as the dogmas of science. It also extends into his own thinking and alternative theories, especially of morphic resonance and morphic fields, whose heresies, like those of future causation and panpsychism, have proved provocative, especially to the self-appointed guardians of orthodox science, who see themselves as old-style crusaders fighting for science and reason against the forces of superstition. And it's particularly to these guardians of materialist science, personified by the various skeptics who appear in the book, Lewis Rupert, Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, that Sheldrake directs his heretical science, partly I think as a riposte to these missionaries of scientific correctness, whose attitude to him and his work he shows to be a consistent pattern of denunciation and dismissal from people he claims, and I think with some justification, who have absolutely no interest in his evidence. So in these different ways, Sheldrake is a scientist, pursuing open-minded inquiry, but critical of a science unwilling to take his science seriously and defined as a heretic by his detractors. So that's part one. And turning now to part two, I'll now look at the critiques he makes of orthodox science. And I've called these sociological and scientific, but here I'm using the classification of sociological as a placeholder for a much wider series of arguments that can very loosely be characterized as historical, psychological, philosophical, and of course sociological. Disciplines which look critically not so much at the content of science, but at its human and social practice. So that, historically speaking, Sheldrake argues that from its very beginning, the apostles of the scientific creed were alive to its power, most notably Francis Bacon, who in the late 16th century cemented the idea of science as a form of supremacy with his prophetic equation, knowledge is power, a power which he argued should be nurtured by a state-based scientific priesthood. And indeed, from the Enlightenment onwards, Bacon's vision has become scientific destiny, spread worldwide through European empires and ideologies, almost entirely globalized, institutionalized and professionalized. Bacon's vision has become real. Millions have been converted to the scientific view, and almost everywhere, Sheldrake argues, there now exists a state-sponsored scientific priesthood as the new secular custodians of truth, shaping government policies on the arts of warfare, industry, agriculture, medicine, education and research. And in so doing, he tells us that science itself has become a power-structured hierarchy, elitist, undemocratic and authoritarian, taking for itself an ethos once claimed by the Catholic Church of monopoly, universality and absolute authority, which it now articulates in a command structure of scientific prestige and authority, with physics and its claim to understand the nature and origin of all things at its apex, and the heresies of psychic phenomena and alternative medicine excluded altogether. In psychological terms, Sheldrake highlights the cognitive dissonance and conformism of many scientists who know that their denial of such things as consciousness and subjectivity is really, as he puts it, just for office hours, a kind of falling in line with the dominant expectations of establishment science, regardless of their own privately held beliefs, just as those who become professional scientists have shown a kind of reliability to get the correct results over many years. And the power of expectations and the pressure to conform to them, Sheldrake contends, is very much a feature of our science, giving numerous examples of how a variety of experiments have shown how the beliefs and expectations of scientists directly influence their results, and which, in another context, has been given the name intellectual phase locking. In philosophical terms, Sheldrake tells us that the scientist replaces the philosopher as the ultimate Platonic hero, who, like the prisoner in Plato's cave, breaks free from the shadows of our inferior reality and is able to see things as they really are, to see reality as it truly is, as if scientific minds are somehow freed from the normal limitations of bodies, emotions and social obligations, giving them power to travel beyond the earthbound realm of senses and to see all of nature as if from outside and with a godlike mathematical knowledge of the vast reaches of space and time. And such claims, Sheldrake maintains, were very much part of its bid for status and prestige. And while few scientists would openly speak this way, and indeed most are unconscious of the myths, the allegories and the assumptions which shape their social roles and political power, it is still the case that as a discipline it consciously sought to overplay its objectivity through a disembodied and impersonal style of speech, a voice so passive and mechanical that it can pretend to somehow be detached from its human source, presented as a view from nowhere, empty, without opinion and without interests. But for the sociological perspective, science is very much a practice from somewhere. That is to say, science is a social practice and it's embedded in society. And the real purpose of these myths is to hide the social and human context within which science is actually practiced. So that for Sheldrake, scientists are neither Platonic heroes or disembodied voices. They are human beings subject to the usual constraints of social life, including peer group pressure and the need to conform. And here Sheldrake cites the work of Bruno Latour, who has shown the ways in which scientists build up networks of support and use their resources and results to increase their power and influence, and ultimately to compete for funding, prestige and recognition. And all of this aligns very closely to the ideas of Thomas Kuhn, who in his seminal work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, argued that science is practiced within a shared framework of assumptions and agreed practices which make up a paradigm of what science is and how it should be conducted, defining what kinds of questions scientists can ask and how they can be answered, and of course, setting out its boundaries and explaining away any phenomena that doesn't fit, all of which is policed by the professors and chairs of scientific boards whose own social prestige and power is bound to the orthodox theories they have helped to create. And in all of these ideas, Sheldrake is making a case for an understanding of science in a broad context and one that emphasises its social role, power and human character. And it's through those filters that he paints a picture of contemporary science as falling far short of the Ricky Gervais thesis of science that it's humble and it seeks the truth. Indeed, for Sheldrake, the two salient features of current scientific practice is its widespread corruption by big business and the related breakdown in its standards, all of which are part of the reason why he believes that science needs a renewal. And of course, to talk of big business is to talk of big pharma, and it's perhaps not that controversial that Sheldrake emphasises the extraordinary power of big pharma, its financial control over regulatory agencies, and its capacity to lobby governments, fund medical research, and deluge society with adverts. Arguably, its greatest achievement has been to medicalise American society into a destructive dependency on prescription drugs. And for Sheldrake, there are echoes here of the corporate science playbook, first drawn up by the tobacco industry and now deployed by energy companies, to, as one tobacco executive put it, develop a strong body of scientific data and opinion in defence of the product. And Sheldrake documents the impact this has on science in all sorts of ways, whereby, for instance, medical communication companies, concerned not with scientific inquiry, but with commercial PR, offer large fees to scientists to put their names to articles and scientific papers, ghostwritten by them, the PR companies, and sold to drug corporations as bona fide scientific papers to be submitted to scientific journals, to develop a strong body of scientific data and opinion in defence of the product. Indeed, the business model of academic journals is perhaps Sheldrake's most compelling example of the way that financial pressure is working to undermine academic credibility. And these journals are vital to the academic world, and they're exceptionally profitable for business. For the academic world, they're key to the promotions, grants, career prospects and status of scientists, university departments, and even entire universities. For the publishers, they're profit monsters because on one hand, scientists either write the papers for free or pay to get them published, while on the other, scientific libraries pay enormous amounts of money to subscribe to these journals, and everywhere there is a permanent pressure to publish as many papers as possible, preferably with striking conclusions and positive results, that is to say, papers with high impact scores. And what this means in practice is that there are a whole host of pressures working relentlessly against maintaining the originality, authenticity and transparency of work that is repeatable, testable and falsifiable. Indeed, the journal system has everyone locked into a process that rewards selective publication of positive data, leading to the so-called file drawer effect, discourages original and high-risk research, and most crucially means that independent replications, that is to say, the idea that scientific claims are tested and retested, which is supposed to be the very foundation of the scientific method, that these are rarely performed. And the culmination of all this is the so-called reproducibility crisis revealed by a series of trials between 2011 and 2016, which one after the other found an extraordinary number of published results were just not reproducible. And Sheldrake offers numerous examples of these, including a large-scale study which attempted to replicate the results of 100 papers published in 3 leading journals, and which could only substantiate 36. And here then is another reason why science as currently practiced is in desperate need of renewal. And that ends the sociological component of Sheldrake's critique of science, and turning now to part 3, I'll look at his scientific appraisal. And here, Sheldrake wants to argue that it's not just the way that science is practiced which has it alienated from its own ideals, but that the very positions that it has taken has also hemmed it into a series of contradictions and inconsistencies, and what Sheldrake also feels to be a stifling certainty. And these are, of course, elaborated in his list of 10 dogmas. But behind these, I'd argue, there are 3 broader targets, namely what he calls, firstly, mechanistic science, secondly, materialist science, and thirdly, their shared insistence on a series of fixed and absolute laws. And before setting out his objections, it's useful to say what he means by these. So, beginning with the first of these, mechanistic science, and here Sheldrake reminds us that the scientific revolution was at the same time a mechanistic one, brushing aside the Aristotelian-inspired medieval belief that plants and animals were shaped by their souls, and reframing nature, once conceived as a living organism, to become a machine of lifeless parts, presided over initially by God, now cast as a divine watchmaker and the first mover in a mechanistic universe, but ultimately, as the scientific revolution unfolded, bit by bit, all the last vestiges of non-material life, including God and consciousness, were either eliminated altogether, reduced to machinery, or progressively simplified and compacted to the chemistry and physics of cells, molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles. And this reduction of everything to physics is, of course, what Sheldrake also means by materialist science, his second target, which decrees that matter is the only reality. What Francis Crick calls the astonishing hypothesis that you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your personal identity, and your free will are no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells, the whole of subjective experience, nothing more than grey matter. Thus, consciousness is at best an epiphenomenon, that is to say, a functionless byproduct, or a form of emergent complexity, but either way, it originates from the workings and physical properties of brains, so that the brain becomes the material home of all consciousness, even the consciousness of the external world, which in effect is a simulation of an outside world made by and existing inside the workings of the brain. Similarly, memory is again material, stored in the brain as material traces called engrams, located either in chemical changes inside nerve cells, in the synapses between them, or in more diverse and complex, but nonetheless material, reflex arcs. And likewise, human purpose and development is also material. Though this time, even though it's hard to think of anything more significant to a living being, these are not located in the brain, but materially coded in our genes, so that our genome is, in President Clinton's words, the book in which all life has been written. And the language in which this book of life has been written, like the language of all materialist science from its beginning, is the language of maths and law, from which ultimately comes the laws of nature. So that all the founding fathers of mechanistic science, Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Kepler and Newton, were either Platonists or Pythagoreans who saw in maths a kind of higher reality, a transcendent and eternal realm outside of space and time, and who saw the business of science as finding the mathematical patterns underlying the natural world. As Galileo expressed it, the universe was a book written in a mathematical language, and as the physicist James Jeans put it, the universe can best be pictured as consisting of pure thought, of what we must describe as a mathematical thinker. And the condensed expression of maths and mathematical thinking are mathematical laws, laws which, like maths, are precise, certain and eternal. And again, for the founders of mechanistic science, the idea of the eternal and fixed laws of nature was both central to their science and also fitted well their image of God as a kind of cosmic emperor issuing by decree the laws of existence. And although today physics has no time for a divine lawmaker, the idea of the fixed laws of nature, precise, certain, and above all, eternal, remains a core belief. And Sheldrake gives many examples of these laws, including the velocity of light, the universal gravitational constant, the big G, and the fine structure constant. Though there is one in particular to which he devotes a whole chapter, and that's the law of the conservation of matter and energy, which he tells us has become a great unifying principle of physics, and which, as its name implies, states that the total amount of energy always remains the same. Its forms can change, but the total amount never varies, which is to say that energy cannot be destroyed or created, but it can and does transform, linking all physical phenomena in a web of energy transformations. And it's from these propositions of mechanistic materialism and law-bound physics that, as you can see, most of Sheldrake's 10 dogmas can be found, and which for him are the scientific articles of faith. And Sheldrake emphasises how deeply held and deeply embedded these are in the thinking of most scientists. But again, he argues that these are assumptions, not substantiated by empirical observation, and should be treated not as truths, but as hypotheses to be tested. And in this book, that's what Sheldrake intends to do, and as you might expect, he finds them deficient and wanting. And turning to the critique proper, I'd argue that this has two scientific foundations from two highly sophisticated theoretical models, both rich in explanatory power, and from which Sheldrake draws both for his critique and for his suggested alternatives, namely quantum mechanics and Big Bang theory. Starting with the first of these, quantum mechanics is foundational to his critique, and in many ways it was an outgrowth of materialist physics, but ultimately came to transcend it, so that in the words of Karl Popper, with quantum theory, materialism transcended itself, replacing substance and certainty with the uncertainties of a quantum world, where matter is both wave and particle, can be spread across space and time, is mediated through virtual particles that come in and out of existence, is transformed by the minds of those who observe and measure it, and where physical predictions can only be made in terms of probabilities. In other words, with quantum theory, the bottom has fallen out of the materialist world, and what was once a solid world made of things is now a set of vibrating processes whereby matter has become highly packed vibrating energy transformable into other forms of energy. And the consequence of all of this for Sheldrake is that a whole host of materialist dogmas now look less and less convincing. As Sheldrake puts it, materialism provided a seemingly simple, straightforward worldview in the late 19th century. But 21st century science has left it behind. Its promises have not been fulfilled, and its promissory notes have been devalued by hyperinflation. And in many ways, Sheldrake's book is one long refutation of materialism with numerous examples, one of which is Crick's astonishing hypothesis that consciousness is no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells, a claim which he says we can no longer take at face value. To use a phrase often used against Sheldrake, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And after 400 years, he tells us, mechanistic science has made almost no progress in understanding how the brain produces subjective experience. And as Sheldrake puts it, materialism's biggest problem is that consciousness does exist. You are conscious now. And after surveying the various materialist dismissals of consciousness, he concludes, if all of these theories sound unconvincing, that's because they are. Likewise, the material home of memory, the so-called engrams, remain an unsolved mystery, as acknowledged in 2016 by a forum of 19 leading researchers in memory, who concluded the mechanism of memory remains one of the great unsolved problems in biology. And to substantiate this, Sheldrake details numerous experiments which show how memories continue to exist, often in the form of learnt behaviours, long after our brains are damaged or degenerate, or when large amounts are removed in experiments on poor defenceless animals. And they also persist within bodies in constant change and metamorphosis, surviving various forms of constant cell turnover and transformation. Similar disappointment for the materialist cause comes with genetics, whose Human Genome Project seemed like biology's crowning moment, bringing exhilaration, hope, and millions of dollars. But again, Sheldrake tells us the predictive value of genomes turned out to be small, and the gulf between the rhetorical claims of enthusiastic scientists and what turned out to be the case quite big. As it turns out, Sheldrake asserts, they contain no blueprint or plan for the making of a body. They merely code the sequence of amino acids in protein molecules. There is no gene for curly hair or nest building, and they are not selfish or ruthless. Equally, the fixed laws of nature, and Sheldrake's example of choice, the law of conservation of matter and energy, is also now violated, this time by the Big Bang, which Sheldrake tells us has brought a still more fundamental challenge to the certainties of classical physics, where a mechanistic eternal clockwork universe has given way to an evolutionary one. And in a universe that came from nothing, there was clearly no conservation of matter and energy. Instead, all was created in the singularity of the Big Bang. As Terence McKenna put it, give me one free miracle, and from there the whole thing can proceed with seamless causal explanation. The one free miracle was the sudden appearance of all matter and energy in the universe, alongside all the laws that govern it. And as the universe unfolds, new energy keeps coming into existence, this time in the form of dark energy, powering the continued expansion of the universe, and currently thought to be about 68% of its mass and energy. And in so doing, this new creation of energy also violates the second law of thermodynamics and its prediction of a universe on a path of entropy towards its inevitable heat death. So then, in all of these ways, and in many that I haven't mentioned, Sheldrake offers a comprehensive critique of science. And, of course, he does so at least partly to clear the ground for his own ideas and theory, which brings us to the final part, Part 4, Sheldrake's Alternatives. And although I've called it Sheldrake's Alternatives, it's worth saying that Sheldrake's own thinking is not organised into a singular, unified kind of grand theory, or at least not in this book. It's tentative, modest, suggestive, incomplete, and eclectic, combining sophisticated theoretical lines of argument with down-to-earth ideas and suggestions. And it's also very much built on and contributes to the work of others. His two most distinct, if incomplete, ideas are those of morphic resonance and morphic fields. And again, these can be seen as drawing from other theories and contributing to larger debates. In particular, they draw from the insights of quantum theory, field theory, and Big Bang theory, and contribute to a series of arguments theorizing on the possibilities of an evolving and purposeful universe. Thus, from quantum theory, he cites Alfred North Whitehead, whom he credits as probably the first philosopher to recognize the radical implications of quantum physics, and who saw the processes of human consciousness as analogous to quantum events, which, like the workings of the quantum world, contain alternative virtual possibilities coexisting at the same time. And like quantum particles, these are in a superposition of multiple potential future outcomes. And just as in quantum theory, measuring particles collapses their superposition into a singular place, so human choices collapse multiple possibilities into a singular position, so that in effect, human actions have both physical causes rooted in the past and mental causes rooted in the future. As Sheldrake puts it, conscious minds choose among possibilities, and their choices collapse possibilities into actions that are observable in the physical world. The arrow of causation is from the virtual future going backwards in time. And in order to locate all of these possibilities across the full spectrum of time, Sheldrake also draws from field theory, which, as with the electromagnetic, gravitational and quantum fields, are energies which shape, contain and influence phenomena across space and time, allowing such things as consciousness and memory to exist both outside the material world, which is to say to endure beyond bodies and brains, but also to be located in both the past and the future. And finally, from Big Bang Theory comes an evolutionary cosmology which sees the universe not as a mechanical process driven by fixed laws, but as an evolutionary unfolding, developing habits as it goes along, as a kind of accumulated memory, and which at the same time is simultaneously guided by purposes from the future. And here Sheldrake shares with other theorists the idea that purpose and consciousness pervade the universe, and that, as argued by Thomas Nagel, it has a cosmic predisposition to the formation of life and consciousness, so that all life is part of a vast creative process unfolding through the whole of evolution, which orders the universe, gives experience to matter, and imparts varying degrees of consciousness to all self-organizing systems, including atoms, cells, and animals. And the ultimate purpose that it strives towards is unity and wholeness, which it brings into being by creating more and more complexity in a matrix of integrated structures made up of what Arthur Koestler calls holons, which may be seen as building blocks in a vast structure of parts which are themselves wholes made up of other parts which in turn are wholes, in a system of nested hierarchies of parts within parts across time and space, from subatomic particles through to planets, solar systems, galaxies, and the entire universe. This, then, is the conceptual world to which Sheldrake locates his ideas of morphic resonance and morphic fields, arguing that morphic resonance are habits whereby the principles of organisation and the patterns of behaviour of atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, plants, animals, and animal societies resonate across time and space, becoming reservoirs of experience to which all life draws upon and to which it contributes, creating both collective as well as self-memory in a vibrating field of life imprints which connects the past to the future. And if morphic resonance works across time and space, then the idea of morphic fields, Sheldrake tells us, is more local, conceived as fields working in and around specific life systems, organising their movements and instincts, shaping their habits and minds, and coordinating their behaviour in a constellation of fields where each species has its own morphic field, and each morphic field has its own set of purposes, which he calls attractors, and pathways of change that he calls triodes. And these morphic phenomena may be seen as Sheldrake's suggested alternatives to the orthodoxies of materialist science, whereby morphic resonance and morphic fields are offered as non-materialist explanations of consciousness and memory, provide an alternative to the fixed laws of nature, and form part of a larger series of arguments that restores the idea of purpose to all forms of life, including that of the universe itself. And if these are Sheldrake's contribution to the big questions facing science and humanity, his range and interests cover a multitude of less cosmic, though equally heretical topics, which, now that the old certainties of materialist science have been dislodged, he argues open themselves up to rekindled free inquiry. Topics such as inedia, or living without food, telepathy in humans, traditional societies and animals, including unseen gaze detection, better known as knowing when someone is staring at you, human and animal premonition of disasters, the exploration of prana and chi as forms of energy, and the possibilities of other sources of free energy from the quantum or the quintessence fields. Much more down to earth than these are a series of suggestions for the renewal of science, including making debates, dialogues and public participation part of its practice, engaging seriously with other explanations of nature, including the insights of shamans, and using the professional training of Buddhist meditators to understand the mind from inside, and collaborative explorations, open debate and shared investigation with religious knowledge around near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, lucid dreaming, mystical experiences, where the stars have lives and purposes, or if nature has within it the spontaneous principle of creativity. This then is Sheldrake's The Science Delusion, a vibrant tour of scientific limitation and possibility. I imagine that there will be some scientists who don't recognise themselves in his depiction of its dogma, and as a non-scientist, it's impossible for me to evaluate his scientific accounts. But if the value of a book is in its capacity to change minds, then I can honestly say this has changed mine, or at least significantly modified my own materialism. And as a book about science, it's endlessly stimulating, thought-provoking, and deliciously unorthodox.